So, my chosen topic of the day is how GMO skeptics resemble climate change deniers. And I'm going to tell this story a bit from my own personal experience, because my own journey as an activist and as an environmentalist and as a science communicator has very much been around these kinds of themes. So if you've seen me tell my story before, apologies if it's a bit repeated, but I do think it's important to try and illustrate from a personal perspective how some of these things happen. Now, there we go. So can you spot which of those people is me? No? So that's us in a crop of genetically modified oilseed rape in 1999, I think. And if I try and think back about my own opposition to GMOs, where it came from, what was it that motivated me into thinking that this technology represented almost existential threat to nature and to the countryside as I perceived it, and as my colleagues in the environmental movement perceived it. Now, one of the things which really hit us deeply was this idea that there was foreign genes moving between unrelated organisms. So the transgenic, the whole Franken thing, right? We didn't know that there was such a thing as horizontal gene transfer then. We assumed that there were these hermetically sealed things called species, and that it was impossible ever for them to move genes between them, and that therefore the human invention of recombinant DNA was something that the biosphere had never seen for billions of years. And actually the first scientists who developed it also thought that. So it wasn't until much later, as we began to understand more about genetics, that we actually could see that genes were much more fluid than was previously assumed. And anyway, this idea was that genetic pollution was somehow there, biological pollution, different from chemical pollution, right? If you spray a pesticide, then it kind of dissipates. If you put biological pollution, then it can, because it's living, it can proliferate. So we thought that was a different category of environmental threat. And we also thought that this was somehow archetypal with the takeover of corporations of agriculture. That particularly this was Monsanto's Roundup Ready, which really gave this impression, was that using a herbicide-tolerant crop was the absolute epitome of monoculture, right? You have to spray the whole crop with the herbicide, and therefore the way that Monsanto introduced genetic modification into the food supply seemed to be in order to encourage everything that was bad about modern agriculture as we saw it. Now, my own scientific education began after that time in this room here, which is at the basement of the Radcliffe Science Library at Oxford University. I was interested in climate change, and as an environmentalist, way back in about 2000, I knew I needed to get educated on the science. I couldn't just say, well, look, it's raining, or there's a flood, or hurricanes, or something. I wanted to actually make sure I had some scientific evidence underlying my work. And so I actually kind of educated myself on the science, and I wrote a couple of books, and even got a prize in 2008, this was from the Royal Society for the Science Books Prize. So I was very proud of this, because I was thinking, I want to be taken seriously as a science communicator. And partly because I had this inferiority complex, because at university I don't have a PhD, I studied history of politics at university, so I knew that I wasn't a proper scientist. Right? I was a journalist who was taking science and trying to communicate it, but that meant as a non-expert myself, I had to make an extra effort to get it right, because I felt I had a responsibility. If you're going to educate the public and you're not an expert yourself, then you have to make more of an effort to get it right than people who already consider themselves to be experts. Now, what was a bit embarrassing, though, was that 2 days after I got this prize for my science writing, I got a phone call from the editors of the Guardian newspaper saying, paraphrase, some government minister said something positive about GMOs, and we want you to write a standard anti-GMO piece. And I was like, yeah, no problem, that'll take me half an hour. Off it went. And the comments below the line, when this piece appeared, you don't normally read below the line comments because that's where the mad people go. But actually, it got to me because people were pointing out that I had no evidence. Underlying my assertions, I was saying that genetic pollution, all of the standard talking points, but there was no evidence. I was not pointing to any peer-reviewed papers to back up my assertions. And I've been obsessed with peer-reviewed papers when I was talking about climate change. So why the discrepancy? Why the difference in approach? And it was very much brought together for me when I was talking about climate change. I would use the concept of scientific consensus. And so I'd use statements like this, which is the consensus of the American Association for the Advancement of Science, right? So I've talked to audiences who are often skeptical of climate change by this point, because it was already becoming polarized. And say that if you have to take what the experts say seriously, these are the people who looked into the evidence. You can't just dismiss them when 97% of the world scientists say that global warming is real and it's largely caused by humans. But of course, the problem I had was that when the equivalent statement came out in 2012 on crop biotechnology from the same organisation, using the same kind of language, I couldn't say I accept one scientific consensus and then I reject the other scientific consensus because that conflicted with what I already believe on GMOs. And if you look at scientists using the same language, right, the science is quite clear, properly proven by modern molecular techniques and biotechnology. So, to be consistent as a science journalist, science communicator, I have to accept scientific consensus, or at the very basis, use that as the beginning of my point of inquiry, not just reject it outright because it conflicts with my ideology. And yet, that's what everybody does. In the people who are GMO skeptics, reject the scientific consensus, and they even produce no consensus statements, just as the climate change deniers do. And yet they don't see the connection because they tend to come from different political perspectives. And I made a speech about this in 2013 in Oxford at an Oxford Farming Conference. It got a fair amount of undeserved attention. Some of it positive, some of it fairly negative.
Excuse me, can I just interrupt a sec? I'm finding it terribly loud.
Yeah, it is. Maybe I can hold this further away if that helps.
Sorry.
Maybe you have extra sensitive hearing. Now this is a good example of negative attention from. Do you know Mohamed Nasheed? So anyone who's involved in sort of environmental scene, she's like the rock goddess, the Indian guru. She gets $40,000 speaking fees. She's touring around the world all the time. But she accused me of essentially made an analogy of me being a rapist for defending GMO crops, which was I thought was quite the wrong kind of assertion. And actually, she and a lot of the people who are involved in the anti-movement do explicitly reject the scientific method. And so if you look at what she's saying here in this quote, she's saying that the last 500 years, basically since the European Enlightenment, nothing's been learned. Therefore, we have to go back to authentic, indigenous ways of knowing, which is woo. It's bullshit, right? And then, indigenous people aren't ignorant. They know a lot of stuff, but that can also be empirically demonstrated. It isn't just an excuse for woolly thinking and making pseudo-scientific claims, which is basically where this has ended up. I'm going to show you, hopefully, if this works, one of the other. I think we'll see I did a hard talk interview after this, and if I can get the video to work. Now, I've edited out my responses because I think what's really interesting about this is the way the interviewer handles it and the kind of attack I get for it. Can you hear this all right?
The zeal of the convert is a factor not just in religion, but in scientific debate as well. Take my guest today, Mark Lynas, a veteran green activist who led a campaign to vandalize experimental genetically modified crops. Let's start with your very high-profile recent renunciation of your pretty much lifelong commitment to campaign against genetically modified food production. Is it fair to summarise by saying you have concluded that everything you used to think was entirely wrong?
For the most part, yes.
And let's not forget, you were one of the leaders of the anti-GM campaign in the UK. You led a sit-in of the Monsanto company. You led a group of people who destroyed and tried to rip up GM crops in experimental test fields. You can't have seen it that way just because other people told you it was so. You must have done some research.
Believe me, I didn't, and nor did anyone else to my knowledge. I mean, I've written already, so this is on the record, that I haven't read a single peer-reviewed scientific paper about biotech or biology or plant science in general until
that, fair to say, leaves your personal credibility in shreds.
Well, I'm not proud of having thought that way, having participated in a campaign which I think has done real damage.
You're ashamed of the entire approach you took. Your complete lack of intellectual rigour.
I've made a public apology to farmers, both in the UK and in other countries about this. I made a speech where I went on the record and said I'm sorry for having made a contribution to starting this movement and having destroyed crops.
It still leaves you credibility. You are, after all, still Mark Lynas. Your intellect presumably hasn't changed very much. If you were so wrong, so incompetent, so shallow in the past, well,
all the more reason for me to change my mind in response to change. So I think that's an interesting cultural case study of what happens to if you publicly change your mind, right? So what is Stephen Sacco positing as the ideal alternative? That you stay believing the same thing forever as a strong and infallible leader like a medieval pope, presumably. This is what we expect our politicians to do. Because he's used to cross-examining politicians, and the most embarrassing admission they can ever make is that they change their minds. Because this makes you weak. This makes you wrong, right? You're wrong, you're incompetent. And yet this is the absolute epitome of the scientific method, or of evidence-based thinking. If you can't change your mind in response to the facts or the evidence, then you're going to be wrong at least half the time, right? Which is better than being wrong 100% of the time. So I was prepared to change my mind, and I was prepared to talk about it because I thought that was an important thing to do, and that it would kind of, in some ways open up the space, the political space, the intellectual space for other people to come as well and say, actually, yeah, maybe we do need to look more at the evidence of this, because it had become a bit like climate change. It had become a very polarized debate. How many Greens do you know? How many Green parties? How many Green organizations, environmental groups, would be prepared to say that there's any potential benefit from genetic engineering? Almost none. Apparently the Polish Green Party said something, or that they weren't always against GMOs in every single case forever for the next 10,000 years, and that was seen as an enormous, move forward. But, we've got to take what we can get, I suppose. Now, why does this matter in the real world? Well, because people like this lady who we met in Tanzania in February potentially could use this technology to improve their lifestyle. So we're talking about subsistence agriculture, which is affected by drought, increasing droughts from climate change. She's holding the maize crop that they had got in the worst drought that Tanzania had seen for a long time. Now, there's drought-tolerant maize, which is in field trials only a few miles away from this place. And you know what had to happen to it after it had been harvested? They had to burn it. They weren't allowed, because this is GMO, they weren't allowed to take it to farmers for them to grow it or for them to even feed it to their kids and, as maize meal or whatever, because it's GMO. And then they had to dig a big hole, put all of the stuff, burn it in the hole, then fill on top of the hole to make sure that no GMO ash would float around into the neighboring countryside. Because this is just how deep the anti-GMO memes have got around in the population. And this is me visiting the maize trial site. And it was really spectacular that they'd given this maize no water for 3 months, and it was the best maize I ever saw the whole time I was in the country. So these genes really do work, and they really could make a difference to people's lives, particularly given that they are to go out there in a non-commercial environment. So this isn't Monsanto who's going to be selling these seeds to the farmers. This is going to be going out to them philanthropically or through the public sector. Perhaps the best example is with BT eggplant in Bangladesh, which is another place I've spent a lot of time meeting farmers like this. And what I really love about this example is that it's the first GMO food crop that's ever been allowed to be adopted by farmers in a developing country. Every other thing has been blocked in every single country, and there's dozens and dozens of examples. And the antis were not successful in blocking Bangladeshi farmers, smallholder farmers, from getting Bt eggplant. Now, the benefit of this gene is that it's pest resistant. So previously, these farmers were spraying their eggplant, their aubergine crop, up to 140 times. Literally every single day, morning and evening, they would go out and they would spray. They're not wearing many clothes, or they're not wearing any respiratory protection, so they'd have a lot of insecticide in their environment and and it really does affect people's health. And so having a pest resistance gene which enables them to reduce their pesticide sprays by 95% has got to be a good thing, right? As an environmentalist, would you support a 95% reduction in pesticides? Yeah, I did. And yet, the anti-GMO people travel around Bangladesh and they say, you eat this GMO, you let your kids eat this GMO Bt eggplant, they will get paralyzed. And their children will be paralyzed, and so just spreading the kind of conspiracy theories, myths of all different sorts. The most extreme example I had was back in Tanzania when I was speaking to an audience of farmers, and one of them stood up and said, if we eat GMO maize, then our kids will grow up to be homosexual. For real. And they've been told this by the anti-GMO groups who are funded by the European Union through the organic program and stuff. And I'm sure they're all very into, sexual equality and gender diversity and all of that, but they're funding these people out there who are spreading the worst kinds of pernicious myths imaginable. And if we look at the science of GMOs and we look at the meta-studies here, so let's not cherry pick, let's look at the whole reviews of the scientific literature, the upshot is that there's been both increase in yields, but more importantly, there's been a reduction in chemical, in pesticides. Now, it's complicated as always. There's a big reduction in insecticides because of pest resistance, and there's not much reduction at all, if any, in herbicides, because herbicide-tolerant crops were the ones that we originally were objecting to. But again, we need to look at the science of this, and that's what skeptics should do, and that's what environmentalists should do too. And it matters because human domination of the planet, and I'm speaking again as an environmentalist, is becoming extreme. We use half of the world's land to support ourselves, just one species out of all of the millions of species out there. And yet, if we take the conventional kind of green prescription of going back and using smallholder agriculture and being more low-tech and living more embedded in the land and all this kind of stuff, you can sort of summarize this if you do the maths, that you need at least 12 additional planets if we all go back to living as hunter-gatherers when there's a population of 7.5 billion. So this is not a realistic prescription. We cannot feed the population without intensive agriculture. Even if we were to go back to 1961, we'd need the land area twice the size of the United States to feed the population, right? If you were just to go, so that's what your kind of organic planet looks like. We need to plow up all of the rainforests, at least twice the size of the US, in order to feed 7.5 billion people. And we tried to summarize this in this idea of ecomodernism, right? Which is an environmentalism which is scientifically informed, which is evidence-based, and which is comfortable with the idea that we can actually use modern technology to decrease our environmental footprint. After all, that's what modern society is actually best at. And I want to talk about one or two of the other areas where, because there's a lot of common themes here, the other one being nuclear power. I was in a movie called Pandora's Promise, where we took this photo when I was visiting the Fukushima site back in about 2013. So it was still quite hot, radiologically, where we were filming around here. But what struck me most of all was how some of the in a really dangerous way to convince, well, I mean, it's convinced the German government under green pressure to exit from nuclear power, which has meant that they have not been able to reduce their CO2 emissions, which is worse for climate change. The Japanese CO2 emissions have gone up because they've had to burn fossil fuels because they closed down their nuclear power stations. Now, that was more understandable in that case because they had suffered a serious nuclear accident. But you need to get a grip, evidence-wise, on what actually the impacts were, right? Nobody died. Does that make it the worst disaster that's ever happened in the country? No. Does it make it something you can forget about? No. Not rational to what the science says about them. And all of these things, what's in common with them? Well, it's the naturalistic fallacy. People flock to radium hot springs in Europe as elsewhere to get the same kinds of doses that they evacuate from the Chernobyl exclusion zone in Fukushima. And in the radium hot springs, they think it's helping their arthritis or has some health benefit. Maybe it even does. There's even a theory of, I think it's called hormesis, that somehow it triggers the immune system. So maybe it's possible.
Do you think that's good science?
Hormesis, I think it's very, very debatable. I don't think there's much evidence, but I wouldn't rule it out. But in that case, we should all be going into the Chernobyl exclusion zone and having long holidays, right? That would help our arthritis as well, but that isn't what happens. And in fact, in the Pandora's Promise, there's this great scene where one of the interviewees talks about going into these radium hot springs with a Geiger counter and saying to all these people who are sitting there, "You realize this stuff's radioactive?" And they go, "Yeah, man, but it's natural, you know." And you can see the same thing with real disasters that have happened which have been caused by food poisoning. Now, we will worry about the food system and corporations and pesticides. The real danger is bacterial contamination. The E. coli outbreak in bean sprouts in Germany in 2011 killed 50 people and injured 3,000 through HUS. That's the same impact as Chernobyl. Like, does anyone remember it? No. It was very, very quickly forgotten, very quickly covered up, because not because there was a conspiracy, but because nobody has an interest in, organic is just good, it's natural, and so it didn't fit the narrative of bad things. Bad things are high tech. They're created by sort of unseen scientists and big corporations, not by organic farmers just doing their best and putting animal manures on, which maybe have some E. coli and then make their way into the food system, right? And so, again, it's the naturalistic fallacy, and again, this underpins a lot of the vaccination stuff. And if you look at some of the connections between anti-vaxxer campaigns and anti-GMOs, not only is it the same people, but they're motivated by many of the same concerns, which is the naturalistic fallacy again. It's unnatural to stick a vaccine in your child's arm, therefore it must have some impact. And so you don't even need any evidence for this. And I think the strategies are very similar with climate change denialism, to go back to that, but it's different people. So what does this show? It shows that we're all humans and we're all susceptible to motivated reasoning when our ideological, our identity, Dan Kahan's done a lot of work on this, when our kind of political motivations become triggered. There was a paper quite recently looking at some of the ways in which science is conducted fraudulently on anti-GMO, and this is a good example. So this is the same figure which was used between two different papers. And you could even tell when it was pixelated that they'd actually used exactly the same figure, supposedly illustrating two different things, indicating that GMOs were bad for different animals. This was an Italian group that did this. They're currently under investigation, but this was used throughout the anti-GMO community. And of course, there's no such thing as a retraction of a meme on the internet, right? Once it's out there, and when it's being promoted, it gets promoted very widely. Curve matching, right? When you get you can always get curves to line up if you're clever enough with statistics and you choose your time period right. This is what the climate skeptics did to make it. This is from the Greenland ice core, to make it look like the fluctuations of temperature correlated exactly with. I can't remember whether it's the sun or the moon or some other planet, but you could get these curves to line up with the time period they chose, which was the red one. But you extend it back, then suddenly they diverge completely, which is why they cut that bit of data out of their paper. And so a lot of the tactics are the same. They are desperate to get things into the peer-reviewed literature, right? And they will do anything they can, and this is why pay-for-play journals have been such a great thing for the the denialists of each different camp. There's so many journals now with very scientific names where we'll publish absolute shit if you pay them a couple of $1,000s. And they'll come to you all the time. And a lot of the literature that you now see refers to these journals like it's a kind of summary of the peer-reviewed literature. But what do they have in common? They all deny the scientific consensus. They cherry-pick data or cherry-pick papers which have been published by fake experts or people who promoted themselves around there. Like in the anti-GMO space, my favorite is Jeffrey Smith, who's a yogic flyer, right? You should like that kind of thing. He actually believes that he can bounce. They always issue demands for debate. It's like Richard Dawkins with the creationists. He says he doesn't debate the creationists because it looks better on their CV than it does on mine, and I take a kind of similar line, although sometimes if you can beat them, it looks good too. So you need to be tactical about this. Facebook science, anti-elite populism, this is my favorite cartoon about that. I was thinking about that on the plane over. This is from the New Yorker, I think, last week. It's really very clever, though, because there's an intuitive appeal to the sort of democratic, to the populist, isn't there? That everyone should have an equal right to speak about things, right? That's what democracy depends on. And yet everyone is not equally well informed. Not everyone is equally expert on different things. And that, if you say that, if you're standing up for the elite, if you're standing up for the experts, it sounds like that's an elitist thing to do. But actually that's the basis of evidence-based policy, because not everybody can understand everything. There's a really great example of this in Food Evolution, which is a movie which has been made about food and about GMOs, which has it's now available online as well. If I can make this work, I want to just flick through because some of this is just priceless. That's Ben Brook. Let's see. You're going to turn the lights down again.
If this is an organic planet we're going towards, you would see
That's
all
me.
the rainforest destroyed just to feed the current population.
This is something I'm going to look into.
Can we turn this off at all?
Some people can say wild and crazy things.
I trust the social media more than most medical doctors, more than the CDC, more than the FDA, more than the EPA. I don't need a scientific study.
Things like that.
Isn't that great? That's all I wanted to show you.
Wired to make our minds up, and that's it.
We make decisions
I
based
trust,
on
what did she say?
our gut. When was the last time you...
I trust social media more than most medical doctors, more than the CDC, more than the FDA. I trust a blog post. Now, again, that's appealing because intuitively to most people, yeah, sure, it's some ordinary person's perspective. They're standing up for the public interest. They don't have any motivations. They're not paid by Big Pharma or by Monsanto. Of course I believe what I'm reading on Facebook, particularly when it comes from your peer group, and there's a lot of social psychology which shows how powerful this is, that if material assertions come from people who you already trust because you feel like you're aligned with them and their identity, you share identity with them, those are the people you're going to believe, not the experts in the in the lab coats. And I think this sort of populism, this anti-elitism, anti-intellectualism is really what characterizes the so-called post-truth era more than anything, because that's what has given us Donald Trump, this is what's given us Brexit, this is what's given us populist parties politically from the right and from the left, which come out with many of the same things. They all have this anti-elite thing that you mustn't trust big expert. You mustn't trust big science. You mustn't trust big pharma, big corporations of any sort. And if you look at some of the data, you've probably seen this study from Pew. It shows that the gaps between the public opinion and the scientific opinion is greater, wider on GMOs than on vaccines or on climate change or any of the other scientific so-called controversies. And so the Green Movement has done a better job of undermining public understanding of science on genetic modification, even than ExxonMobil has done on climate change. And how have they managed to do that? Because they seem to be aligned with the public interest. Nobody thinks Greenpeace is in it for the money. Well, you do, and you do, yeah. But actually, I don't. I think Greenpeace believes what it does. I think it's an ideological commitment, and no one can say that about ExxonMobil. They are in it for the money. So we tried to bring some of these themes together, focusing in particular on biotechnology for developing countries and access to innovation and science in Africa in the Cornell Alliance for Science, which is where I'm mostly contributing at the moment. We were involved in the March for Science, and I put this meme out actually, and it was one of these things that, this was on Facebook and it had like 500,000 views, but all of the things underneath were brilliant, the comments, like lots of people said, well, I agree with most of them, but GMOs aren't safe, or I agree with all of that, but not the vaccines bit. So people very much have to pick and choose what already corresponds with their political beliefs. So let's end just with a little bit of music and a few scenes from the March for Science, where we were particularly keen to see marches not just in developed countries and rich countries, but also in Africa and lots of out-of-the-way places like Hawaii.
We are the 97%. You get that? Yeah? That's the Cornell people. This slide is important to me because I'm there, and that's my son Tom on the left, who's 12, and that's my daughter Rosa in the middle, who's 10. And you see what her placard says? It says, "I want to be a dancer, but I also like scientists." There we are. Thank you very much.